Hey, I'm Nate Hendricks, owner of Navigator Bookkeeping, and we're here today to talk about all things pay structures, which is super exciting. We know there's a lot of practice owners out there thinking about, does my pay structure for my therapist make sense? Could it be more profitable? Is there a better way I could do this? And it all gets down to the question, how do I get a more profitable practice, right? And pay structures are a big piece of that. So we're going to talk about that today. We have two experts here with us who are group practice owners, who are great at what they do, who are going to talk about their experiences with different pay structures and some ideas they might have as well for how you can think about pay structures a little bit differently. So we're going to get into all of that and talk about so many things. So hopefully this is super valuable to you in the next couple of minutes. So I'll introduce our experts here. We have Christy and Stephanie. They're both practice owners. I'll have them introduce themselves, talk about their practice, their pay structures, and then we'll get into just a super casual conversation about some great ways to be thinking about different pay structures. So Christy, why don't you lead us off here?
Sure, and thanks for that awesome introduction, Nate. So I'm Christy Pennison. I am a group practice owner in Central Louisiana. The practice is called Be Inspired Counseling and Consulting, and it is multi-location. And this is a really cool conversation I like to have because sometimes you don't know what you don't know until you realize that you didn't know it, and then you tried something and it maybe didn't work the way that you anticipated. And so actually, when I dived into this pay structure, I actually started off as contractors, but I quickly found out as our team continued to grow and expand that it was actually limiting for me because in our area, people really valued a lot of the things that an employee model could offer, whether it be a simple IRA or health insurance or PTO or holidays. And so I really had to consider what the team was saying that it needed and it really wanted, and even paying taxes. So at some point, I switched to a W-2 model that was a flat per hour structure. But throughout the years, you just learn as you try and you figure out what's going to work and what's not. So hopefully, we can dive in to some of that today and give some value to those that are watching.
Yeah, great. And we'll definitely cover that 1099 to W-2 switch because I know there's a lot of practice owners who are either in progress there or thinking about that. And it is an overwhelming thing to consider. And it is a big transition. So excited to hear how that was for you and some tips there potentially. So, all right, Stephanie, how about you?
Yeah, so my name is Stephanie Korpal, and I have a private pay private practice in St. Louis, Missouri. And I had just heard on some podcasts and from some consultants about the 1099 to W-2 switch and how cumbersome for some people it could be and how much of a headache. So I just opted to start with W-2 from the beginning. And I do know for some people that is a harder decision. There is a lot about starting a group practice and hiring your first therapist that a 1099 structure really can be the best way to get started. So there definitely are elements of that I want to make sure people understand, like have some significant pros to them. But I am just somebody that I don't deal well with cumbersome. And so I just decided to completely bypass that from the beginning. And I do a flat rate pay per hour. There's a clinical rate and an admin rate that I pay. And I have just increased benefits over time and added some stipends for leadership roles, but we are a full W-2 practice.
Great. Yeah, thanks for sharing. And I'm excited to hear about some of those stipends, how those benefits have come in that transition. Because in my mind, with pay structures, it's not, I'm going to pick this and stick with this forever. It's, we're going to start with this, we're going to build onto it and see how it works with the practice, right? It's always going to be a flexible growing piece.
Yes.
So
and I think it's
like
really important for practice owners to realize they don't have to be stuck in anything because you can inadvertently, like Christy was saying, you don't know what you don't know. You can just kind of inadvertently get into a mindset that what I start with has to be forever what I use, or just because everyone else does it this way, I have to implement it in my business in the same structure. And as long as people's taxes are being paid and you're paying a fair wage, like there's a lot of models and a lot of different things that you can do. And so flexible thinking is the name of the game as a business owner, particularly when it comes to payroll.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, I love what you said. It is so flexible. There's so many options, which makes it really possible to find a solution that works for you, right? You don't need to be pigeonholed into something that someone else has done. Like you said, as long as people are getting paid, taxes are being withheld, there's a different solution that you can think about. So that's really
Yeah.
exciting. Cool. I'm excited to get into that more. And, just to come back to it, why are we talking about this? In my mind, a pay structure, a profitable pay structure is the bedrock that you need to have a profitable practice.
Yep.
If you don't have pay structures that are fair and that are profitable, your practice is going to have a tough time having positive cash flow, having positive profit. So in my mind, when I talk to a practice owner, we talk about their pay structures. If we see pay structures that are meeting the margins they need to be meeting, which just, by the way, is usually around 20% per therapist. If we see that that's in place, everything else can be built on top of that. That doesn't mean it's easy in any way, but that's the bedrock that has to be there to get that profitable practice growing. So that's why we're talking about this, because it's so key. And there's so many questions that come up about this. And this also ties into retention, right? I'm sure you've both seen, how does your pay structure impact team culture? How does it impact people sticking around with the practice? Things like that. So
Yep.
a lot of good things all rolled up in this.
So much. Yeah. Yeah.
All right, cool. So the first thing, before we get into even the pay structures and in the 1099 versus W2, the first thing I just want to talk about is how do we measure this?
Yep.
Because as with most things, if you don't measure this, it's very hard to make changes, right? If you don't know where you are right now, how do you know where you're going? So in my mind, the first thing that's needed is you need to measure your pay structures as far as how profitable they are and how, whether they make sense for your practice. Now we use a tool called the Clinician Profitability Tool. Anyone that's listening to this, I'm very happy to share that with you. You can email me. I'll share my email address and I'll gladly send this to you. It's basically just a tool to put in revenue, put in pay structures, and then see how profitable each of your clinicians are. And then what you can do with this is you can tweak those pay structures to see, okay, if we're right now at hourly and we want to switch to salaried, what changes? How profitable are people? How does that change things? But measuring this is the first step, because you need to see how full capacity are my therapists? How much are they actually making? What are the profitability margins actually on these clinicians? So using a tool like that can be really helpful. It doesn't have to be that tool. Just use something to measure it. You can also use a little bit of a more simple tool. We use a benchmark of 60% of your revenue or less should be going towards your therapist. That's just a real quick check-in. Are we in a space where we need to be as far as profitability, or do we need to change these pay structures in a way to make them more profitable? But either way, you need to be tracking this in some way. Curious what both of you, if you've used anything to track or anything you've seen good or bad on that tracking side, because in my mind, if we're not tracking it, we don't even know where to start. So what have you both seen on that side of things?
Well, Nate, I've used a great tool too, and it's the one that you created. So I've used that tool to just kind of gauge that. And I also think another tool on a big level scale, it doesn't help with like individual therapists, is really understanding your profit and loss statement and having those therapists sometimes coded as like, what I guess bookkeepers would call cost of goods sold, right, Nate? Is that about right terminology? Yep. And so having them, then that can also help you if you're doing your own bookkeeping, or somebody that is doing bookkeeping like Nate can explain to you, then you can look at that profitability pretty quickly, or that gross profit after you take off your payroll expenses. So I think that's just a very, it's not nuanced where you're looking at each therapist and are each therapist profitable for your practice. And we know profitability equals sustainability of your practice, keep on going. And so that's just something I look at a very quick glance sometimes to make sure we're still in a good place overall.
Yeah, I also love the clinician profitability calculator. Before I had that, I had my own spreadsheet. I love a good spreadsheet. I love formulas. And I love being able to like tweak and predict and things like that. So I have built out a couple different spreadsheets over the years that have allowed me to play around with some things and see, if we're this full, this is what the revenue will be, and this is what my take home will be, and things like that. And I think those benchmarks are really helpful. Like what you said, Nate, about it should be 60% or less, because you can go into this and just be thrown a dart blind and not understand, and therapists in particular are people pleasers, and they just want to make everybody happy. So if it's your first hire and you don't have any sort of structure, you may be inclined to pay somebody, 70, 80, 90%. And then down the road, you have to have a conversation about how you can't keep them at that, but you feel so bad. So I actually think when people are starting a group practice, maybe instead of like a coach or a consultant, the first person they should hire should be a bookkeeper or fractional CFO in this area, I actually think you can make a lot better of a head start as a group practice owner with the accounting numbers more than some of the other information. You can hire that coach or consultant later, but I actually think someone like you from the get is money better spent.
Absolutely, because like Steph said, I mean, I have just unfortunately seen people who really want to be generous,
Yeah.
or they compare themselves to like maybe what other practice owners are doing in their area, and they are trying to be competitive
Yes.
because they're like, oh, well, if they're offering this rate or this percentage split or these benefits, then sometimes there's pressure to feel like you have to too. And unfortunately, if you don't understand those numbers, which again, I didn't when I first started. I mean, Steph can tell you, I remember one of the first times me and her met up when we were just starting group practice. I didn't even have anything like bookkeeping wise. And I remember I spent like 8 hours trying to categorize things, Nate, for like a whole year's worth of stuff. Okay, no shame in my game because you don't
No,
know. And so I spent my time doing that because I didn't even know where the expenses were. I didn't know how much things were going to be. And so, like Steph said, I mean, understanding your numbers from jump is
Yeah.
going to be one of the best decisions you'll ever make. And it's going to help you make an aligned decision about how am I going to compensate people that's aligned with how you want your practice to go. But also, that's a good financial decision that will allow you to meet whatever goal you have for your practice of what that looks like, vision, goal.
yeah, yeah, no, great points. And I'm biased too, but I do think hiring someone on the financial side initially is a great idea. But I think that's so true because those decisions you make when you first start your practice, those carry on for so long, right?
For
If you're just
so
hiring,
long.
yeah, it's like this is going to
Yeah.
impact your practice for months and years potentially,
Yeah.
right? So I've seen it many times where, just like you said, Stephanie, somebody hires a clinician at like 70-75% because they're like, I just want to get somebody in the door. I want to be really generous, retain them.
Yeah.
But you're just struggling because so much of your revenue is running through that person. You're keeping so little of it. And that just really hurts a lot of other things where then other therapists coming in might not even be able to be paid at the right rate because you're kind of handicapped from that initial hire, right? So and as I'm sure you both have experienced, or maybe not, but hopefully not, but if you're ever trying to lower someone's pay, that conversation is not going to go well, right? If you're saying, hey, you were at 75, we need to bring you down to 55 or 60, they're not going to stick around, right? So always good to start kind of on an informed level rather than kind of just throwing numbers around.
And it's so much easier to go up than to go down, right? So
Yeah.
even bringing somebody on and saying, I'm going to start you at this percentage, but I would love to have a conversation at 90 days or 6 months about how things are going with the opportunity to raise that. If we see a high show rate, if we see a high retention rate with your clinicians, because the other reality is during your first, I would say 1 to 3 hires, that's also where your startup costs are really high. You have an employment attorney to review offer letters and your employee handbook. You are probably making some pretty significant website changes. You might be adding an admin at that point. And just your operating expenses go up pretty significantly once you add employees as well. Your marketing costs to get people in, so your therapists have work to do. And so if you're starting at 70 or 75% and your operating expenses are really high, you're behind the 8 ball before you even started.
Yeah, and that's what I was thinking as you were sharing that and as you're all both talking. I mean, unfortunately, if you don't kind of set yourself up when in that first hire in a way that feels good to you and that you also know the numbers, then it is going to cost. It's actually you're going to make less than what you were doing by yourself if there's that not consideration of all those things. And then that's not going to feel good because you're going to be like, wait, I thought I was going to grow this group to like maybe help them have more time freedom, or I wanted to create an environment where their therapists could love the work they do and feel like they were in a community setting. And when that money becomes really a struggle, then it doesn't feel good for the group practice owner who's trying to also build this culture that they feel good about and build this organization they feel good about, because they're in the back of their minds worrying about like, how am I going to make this happen, or how am I going to make payroll this month, or how am I going to handle these things? And so I think it's so hard because we all have different money stories and we come from different money backgrounds, and we don't always, I mean, in graduate school, I never had a business class. I never had a financial management 101 class. None of that, right? I didn't take a bookkeeping class, Nate. Okay. Accounting, no, none of that. And so really learning this part or having professionals that can really guide you, kind of like we're talking about, is imperative to just understand and feel confident about the decisions that you're making. And you can backtrack, like we've talked about, but like Steph said, it's challenging. It's easier to go up than it is to go backwards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so true. Well, let's talk a little bit about that kind of initial startup, because, that, like you said, Christy, that initial hire, those couple initial hires, that's usually where you're the least profitable, because you have all these costs, you're bringing on these people, your revenue is dropping down, and you could definitely make more as a solo, right? For sure.
For sure.
You're like, I'm losing money. It's more stressful. Why am I doing this? Right. That's usually what practice owners are thinking right there.
And that's even if you do a good percentage. I need people to know, like,
Yes.
even if you're at the right percentage, your first couple hires, you're not making more yet.
Right. Yeah. It's a good point. It's just kind of that dip. It's going to happen no matter what, right? You're going to be losing money. It's just not going to feel good. So really the goal there is to scale, right? To get to that point where you're having therapists filled up capacity wise, you're hiring more, and the revenue is increasing. If you don't do that, you're going to be kind of stuck in that not fun spot for a long time. So let's talk about one of those first decisions you need to make, right? Which we've already mentioned, 1099 or W-2, right? And how to think through that. Now, obviously there's some legal considerations, right? The IRS determines whether someone is a 1099 or a W-2. And if you're not familiar with those numbers / letters mean, right? A 1099 is a contractor, a W-2 is an employee. A 1099 is just going to get paid a flat amount from you. There's going to be no taxes withheld. You're going to issue them. Both of them are going to get different forms, right? It's almost like two different pathways right here. A W-2 is going to get taxes withheld. You're going to run them through a payroll software or someone running payroll. So it's very different, right? There's going to be different benefit considerations with the W-2 versus a 1099. There's state considerations that come into that. So there's a lot of kind of legal pieces here. Stephanie, you mentioned, working with an employment attorney. You're probably going to want that at some point for the pay structures, but also for whether we should do 1099 versus W-2 even, right? For our state laws. But what have you both learned or noticed? Christy mentioned the 1099 W-2 transition. Any thoughts there on, for someone who's right now thinking about which of those kind of paths to go down or moving from one to the other, considerations?
Yeah, there's the state considerations for sure. For example, in California, you just can't have 1099s. So you do have to consider what the laws are in your state. And then you also have to consider what the laws are within the profession. So in Illinois, for example, a provisionally licensed therapist cannot be a 1099. So there's both the, like, whatever the sector is, what the state says about 1099s, and then also below that, a professional ethics law sort of something. And then I think there are also cultural considerations for what state or city you are in the country. So Christy and I have a friend out in Colorado, and 1099 is working beautifully for her, like so beautifully. And she doesn't want to change. She doesn't want to take on the burden of W-2s. And it works for her. It's not negatively impacting culture. It's not a recruitment issue. But those are other things to consider, because 1099s, you can't require meeting attendance and things like that. So a lot of times culture is something that comes up with choosing a 1099 or W-2, because a lot of therapists that go to a group practice do want a team environment, do want kind of a mission to feel like they are attached to, and that is much easier to deliver with a W-2 setup, because you can have these staff meetings that everybody is in, or other case conceptualization meetings, and just other things that allow that team building and that opportunity to feel connected, because we are a profession where we're behind closed doors all day. So you don't even necessarily, you're not building a PowerPoint deck or something like that where you can just get up and take a break and go see your next door office mate. And so I do think culture is an important consideration for what people that you are looking to hire are looking for.
Yeah, and I was actually, it's funny, me and Steph, we can kind of like read minds now, because I was writing down culture too, because after all the legalities and things like that are taken care of and what you can and can't do, I really do think of what the culture you want your practice to be. And you may not always know that at the very beginning. You may not have a clear idea of what that looks like. But when I say culture of your practice, do you want that like kumbaya team camaraderie where you do, require them to come to so many meetings, and do you want to have a say a little bit more on how they are maybe structuring even what they do? So like how they're coming in, what they're responsible for. Do you want a little bit more of that directiveness to say, hey, here's how we're going to do things? And not that you can't do that with a 1099 structure, but you have a little bit of less freedom to say, hey guys, this is how we're all going to do things. This is what I expect. Here's the accountability. You can still have that, but it's just, there's that fine line of like that structure from the 1099 to W-2 that you really have to consider. And like Steph said, I really do think culture as a whole from where you live is very important to be have a pulse on too, because I know there's some areas that 1099 and therapy group practice is a very common thing. It's something that people are not scared about. There are therapists that will, they actually prefer it. They prefer that 1099 structure. And in that area, 1099 is very common. But I am in a little bit more rural area. And honestly, we don't have a lot of 1099 opportunities. There's not a lot of contractor roles for therapists. And so actually it was a little bit of a harder stretch to get people to wrap their head around being a contractor, because they were so used to positions where they were salaried and employed. And so I do think you have to take into consideration where you live and kind of what kind of trends do you see, but then ultimately how you want the culture of the practice and how you want to do things as a business owner as well.
Yeah, that's great. It's funny because from the financial point of view, I've literally never thought about the cultural point of view on it. So this is why you guys are so great, because you have the completely opposite view that I do on this side, which is so helpful. When you were saying that, the other thing I was thinking about is, some therapists coming in may not have been contractors before. If you're asking them to be a contractor, there's a lot of considerations for them in that, right? Is taxes are not going to be withheld from their paycheck. They're just going to get a check. So a really key thing to do as owners, in my mind, is to make sure they're aware of that, right? Is, hey, you need to be withholding taxes from this personally, because otherwise you're going to get to the end of the year, it's going to be a huge tax bill and you're going to have a world of trouble, right? So it's important to inform your 1099s, if you do have 1099s, about that. Is, hey, let's be withholding taxes. Make sure you're working with the CPA or an EA, get this sorted out and have this planned. And I think that's just a kind and correct thing to do, ethical thing to do for those contractors. So a lot of considerations there, the legal framework. There's a lot of practices that I've seen recently who are making that transition, right? 1099 to W-2. Maybe that's because of state laws. Maybe that's just because of the culture fit, whatever that is. But that's a hard change, because usually what's going to happen, I'm interested to see your guys' thoughts on this, but usually what's going to happen is their pay is actually going to look like it decreases, right? Because it's going from no taxes being withheld to taxes being withheld. And that right off the bat is going to look like a pay decrease. And no one likes a pay decrease, obviously. So this transition is a tricky one, because not only are we dealing with a pay decrease for therapists or a perceived pay decrease, but also the cost for the practice is going to increase, right? You're now covering payroll taxes, which means 7.5% of wages are going to go towards FICA taxes to the government. You might have state taxes on top of that. You're going to have workers' comp insurance. You might have some benefits that need to get added. There might be some PTO requirements, right? Illinois has PTO requirements for employees. Your state may have different requirements, but the cost can balloon very quickly. So in both the years, for both of you, what have you noticed about that transition, either for your own practices or that you've seen in others? And any pros and cons you can think of W-2 employees?
Christy, I'll let you take this one with a little bit more firsthand experience.
Yeah, well, I was thinking about when Nate was saying, like, okay, how you have to educate your people on, like, they're going to be responsible for their taxes. They may even need to consider, if they're 1099, creating an LLC to protect themselves. They're going to have to carry their own malpractice insurance. There's going to have a lot of things where they're going to have to stand alone that they're responsible for, even though they are, working within your organization as a contractor. And I can remember, honestly, I did a survey whenever our team was about 4 or 5 therapists, and I was trying to struggle with, should we change? And honestly, I'll never forget one of my therapists had to pay taxes that year, and they were like, "Oh, I do not like this." So that's how the conversation came in for me. And then also we had reached a stagnant point where we were having a hard time because of the culture of the area drawing in other therapists because they were wanting benefits. They were wanting things like health insurance and time off and things like that. And so I had to do all the number work, Nate, and that's where I was very thankful for calculators and spreadsheets to think about how much taxes, all those things you listed. I'm not going to list them. It's a lot of benefit, especially if you want to offer some benefits. And you don't have to do them all at once. I knew if I was going to make the transition and we were going to go to that model, that I did want to offer a few things at once. And so I had to weigh all those numbers of, okay, if we're doing PTO and we're doing a few holidays and we're doing health insurance, and we're doing a training stipend and we're doing these things, how is that going to factor into their rate of pay? And I did have to decrease pay, and I had to make sure to present all this information in a way where the therapist could actually see that ultimately in the long run, it was going to be a good thing. But it's hard to serve that decrease in pay to individuals. And in my case, I want to say that it was pretty significant that I had to kind of decrease to make sure that we had the room for also growth, to bring in admin support that, are not revenue producing support staff to help the organization continue to grow. And so I think that, the transition ultimately for where I saw the vision of the practice going, which was a very kind of probably even bigger than it is now, multi-location practice with, really big team, that we really needed to make sure that we were offering packages, and I say employment packages for people that would fit the culture and the culture of the organizations, not the culture of the area, but the culture of the organization. And it was some hard conversations. And thankfully, all of those therapists stuck with me for the most part through that transition. And I try to answer any questions very openly and honestly. And ultimately, it was a great decision for our organization because I was also then able to kind of set clear of expectations of how many sessions per week. And not that I couldn't do that before, but I had a little bit more of I felt authority to be able to say, we're going to have weekly staff or, not weekly, but monthly staff meetings. We're going to have consultation time. You're going to have individual supervision. We're going to do community involvement things. We're going to do team fun things, where we're going to go hang out and spend time together. And I was able to kind of show them how this was going to work and how it was going to happen. And then also instill hope in them, like, if we continue to grow, I'm always going to be looking out at what other opportunities I can make it so that it's a great place for you to work, but it's also a place that can be around for the next 10, 20, 30 years, to provide a service to the community. So.
That's great.
Yeah.
If I can just quick jump in, just a couple of things I want to reiterate that I heard from you, Christy. The first one is showing them the pay change and why it's happening and what it means, right? So having some sort of handout or spreadsheet or something that's easily digestible that says, this is where you are now, this is where you're going, and this is why it's not a decrease, or, maybe it's even an increase, right? So I love that you said that.
It is. Yeah, it was an increase in R, but it just didn't come out in the comes out in the final number, not the,
Right. Because I love that you said that, because that is one of the hardest parts of the transition is, we just did this with the practice, and they were changing the therapist percentage 10 percentage points. It was going down 10 percentage points. If you show that to someone, it's like, how in the world is this a positive, right? But once you add in benefits, covering the taxes, them not having to cover the taxes personally, all those things, it did come out to be a positive. So that's always my suggestion is, can you give some sort of one-page handout that says, here's the costs, here's how it's changing. You don't need to get into super gritty details of here's how our profit is changing, but just how is your pay changing? What does that look like? So I love that you shared that. And the other thought I mentioned that I thought about when you were saying that, which will probably come up to in a little bit here, is offer benefits slowly. So I'm going to just leave that there for now and let Stephanie talk, but we can come back to that one here in the future. So
yeah, I just want to say one thing about the one pager for the compensation package, and that is, even if you are not switching from 1099 to W-2, I think that's a really helpful thing to give your hires, either in the, maybe not in the interview process, you could potentially, but during their onboarding, because they might not know at interview time what their session fee for clients is going to be, but they obviously do know what their rate of pay is. And so once they come in and hear what the session rate is, they're going to do the calculation about what their take home is. And they might not ask you questions, probably not, but they're going to have questions. They're going to wonder why you're taking home so much, because they'll assume that it's mostly often going to the practice owner. So I would recommend that sheet, even if you're not switching from 1099 to W-2, because it does really help clarify a lot of things and could prevent some like loose resentment that therapists being hired into the practice don't even realize they have. But inevitably, they're going to go home and calculate, $50 of 125 or whatever and be like, what? But they aren't going to put in those taxes. They're not going to calculate their PTO. They're not going to calculate their health insurance stipend or plan and things like that. So I would just recommend that to
Marketing,
group
the
practice owners.
billing, the EHR, the overhead.
Yeah, but you're not going to
rights,
put that in the one pager.
No, I love that. That's a great idea. Stephanie, any other, you've had W-2 employees, you still do, obviously, considerations there that you can, benefits of having W-2, how you've seen that be for your employees. What's kind of your thoughts? Like that status, what does it look like?
I didn't even consider 1099s. So like not at all. And I don't know if it's because I heard enough podcasts or anything. But I also don't think W-2 is as complicated to offer as what it might seem when you are getting started. I mean, you just pick some payroll software and follow the steps to get started. And I don't mean I do remember when I started with my payroll software the first time, I was like, why is no one on the phone with me helping me do this step by step? But that's again where I think actually a bookkeeper or a fractional CFO, like just consulting with you the first couple months, is actually the best decision you can make, because they will help you understand this is the 7.5% of tax. Like, and I don't know about you, Christy, but I was really overwhelmed with the setup of the stuff. Now, granted, this was also during COVID. I had more clients than I could handle, which is why you hire. But like I was doing 28 or 30 sessions a week and also trying to figure all of this out. And it was COVID, the beginning. So my brain capacity might not have been what some other people's might be. But all of that to say, W-2 isn't necessarily that complicated.
Yeah.
So it might be nice to just think about writing one check for a 1099, but it's not like you're sitting there with an abacus, right? With a W-2, and it's taking hours. So I just want to float that out there too.
And I want to point out something Steph said, because I think this is very important, especially if you're listening to this conversation and you're contemplating a group practice and you're not already in the nitty gritty and you know some of the complexities of this, is that when you typically are starting a group, you are having a very full caseload. And it can be very daunting or overwhelming to figure this stuff out. And so I do recommend, like she said, whether it be getting some support from someone who can help you figure it out, or making sure you are prioritizing carving out the time to have the brain space to think of all this stuff and then also implement. It's going to be really important, because it is hard because in that first stage of group practice, because you still are normally carrying a pretty significant caseload, and then you are trying to make all these decisions of onboarding people into your practice, where that structure maybe is just developing and it's not already established, because we all got to start somewhere. So
right. Yeah, that's good to hear. And yeah, I think that's so true. W-2 feels more complicated, and it is at baseline, but once you get into it, it's not necessarily a huge amount of work, right? Clients that we talk to that are in payroll are not spending hours and hours on payroll. It's like pretty simple, pretty straightforward, have a process, and you can go that route. So I think to tie up 1099 versus W-2, and I'm sure we'll touch on aspects of that here as we talk about pay structures specifically. But I think in my mind, the main takeaway is communicate clearly to your team if you are doing a transition, right? Or if you're not, like Stephanie mentioned, when you're just hiring someone, just communicate about the pay. They're going to figure that out anyway. So just communicate get the facts straight to them. If you're doing a transition, make sure you communicate, give them plenty of lead time to prepare for that transition, give them a one pager to talk about that, have, plenty of space to meet with them, talk through that transition. So it's not a traumatic experience for them. And it sounds like, Christy, you did that really well with your team. I mean, keeping your team around during that transition, that's the key thing. Can we retain people, not lose people, right? So I think in my mind, that's the big thing, is communicate about it, be transparent about it, and just have space for people to question about it, because it's not always very clear. It's like, how are taxes work with this? How are they withheld? So just have space for that. So yeah, let's talk about pay structures somewhat, because now we've talked a little bit about 1099 versus W2. There's not necessarily a right answer there, and the same is true for pay structures. There's not a right answer here, but there's a lot of possibilities.
Yeah.
So let's just go through some of the kind of the big options, and then let's also be aware, though, that you can be more creative on top of these, right? You can make a hybrid, you can mix and match. Let's just start with hourly, and then we'll go into like a commission split after that. But yeah, what are any thoughts on hourly pay, pros and cons there, why therapists should or should not consider that?
I know some people do a, percentage as W-2, and I want people to know that that is an option. But yeah, I think I just listened to the experts when I did it, and I just went with flat rate for hourly. I know there are some people that love tier models. I didn't do much tiering. I think it was because I always kind of figured when somebody's starting, that's kind of when they need the money. I don't have 24 clients for them for 24 sessions a week. So I don't know why I would pay somebody lower, and maybe that's not great, because now I'm at a place where a little bit I want tiers. But there is the tier option. So, sessions 1 through 12 are paid at this rate, 13 through 20 at this rate, and then 20 above at this. Or you could give people just bonus above whatever you want at 20. Every session above 20 is paid at $5 more a session. I know some people do, once you hit a certain number of sessions, maybe 24, all sessions are paid at a higher rate. So those are all options to consider. And I think that can feel really good to the therapist, when they have a high show rate, when they have a good retention rate. The tricky thing, I think, is depending on what your local Facebook groups are doing, where therapists are in them, there may be some harping you hear about group practice owners being these like productivity bosses, and how it is anathema to the field and creates rates of burnout and things like that. And there might be some people listening to this that do agree with that. It's hard. I think you have to survey the land and consider things. I do think there is a consideration to burnout. And then you also just kind of have to consider what does work for the practice. You have to consider the practice first, and then for yourself and for your employees. And I do think it's nice for somebody to be able to get a bonus, or, a higher rate if you do the tier structure, if they're a really good therapist that keeps their clients and people don't cancel with them. And there should be some reward for that, I think. Again, and I would also maybe wait until you've been a group practice owner for a year before making things too complicated, because it is amazing what decisions you make with more data, and you just need time for things to shake out. So when you're getting started, I would keep things simple, right? So that doesn't mean underpay anybody, but just keep things simple. And it's going to be hard. You might lose people. You're going to lose people anyway, no matter what decision you make. So just kind of like hold the line, hold your horses, and give things enough time for you to have an understanding about how to be a group practice owner to make different decisions about pay.
Yeah. Well, and I can think about this, especially I'm an insurance-based practice, so it's a little bit different than Steph. She's all private pay. We do have some private pay, but I'm thinking about, we haven't gotten to the commission split, but I know for a lot of insurance-based organizations, sometimes they do a commission split over maybe an hourly. But I ended up actually going through hourly, and I'll just tell you my thought process, and both of them can work. Both of them can work. All of these, like Nate says, you can do this any kind of way. You just got to figure out what is most important to you and what is most important to your organization, and how do you want to structure that. And so for me, one of the things that I knew that the therapist really wanted was that predictability of income. Now, so that's why I went with hourly, so that regardless if us as an organization has gotten paid, I want to make sure that they were paid timely every 2 weeks for the work they had done. Now, the challenge of that for insurance-based practices is that sometimes you don't always have that income in yet from those services provided. And so I do want to go ahead and put that disclaimer out there when you are trying to determine what kind of structure you want for your pay, especially between the hourly and the commission split. I mean, we also have the salary, and I guess we'll get into that in a minute, but trying to decide between those two, you do need to know, do I have enough runway or do I have enough cash on hand to be able to sustain, maybe not getting paid for 30 days, maybe with this whole change healthcare situation, how much runway do I have to be able to have, still pay salaries or still pay hourly or still pay, if I don't have that coming in. But still, again, a value of the organization for me was predictability of income, because I was, again, in a culture that people were used to that predictability of income and the type of roles and positions they had. And so if I was asking them to be brave and come jump into private practice where there's not as much predictability sometimes because a lot of their pay is based off of, since it's hourly, what they're doing, I wanted to have that piece. So I do think that's something else to think about, but I know a lot of people have went to the commission split, because then sometimes that commission split that, and therapists get used to that model too.
Yes.
That once payment is collected, then they get that percentage split of the payments collected. The downside to that is if for some reason you don't collect payment, or which is a really an upside for the practice, not necessarily the therapist, is that then they would not have compensation for that service. However, I think a lot of people that do commission splits, they have really good, typically I've heard from my practice owner friends, great billing departments who really work hard to make sure all of those services are collected upon, to make sure that that therapist does get compensated for the work they've done.
Yeah. And that just brings up a small picture, right, of how many differences there are even just on those two models, right? As far as when are therapists paid, is it based on collections? Is it based on work done? Right. And there's just so many options there and considerations, like you said, with that, like cash flow is a huge consideration for most private practices, for all private practices. This is going to be the biggest portion of their expenses is payroll, right? So is that based off the work that's being done right now, or is that based off the money we're being received? Sorry, grammar issue.
That money you getting in, Nate. That's how we talk about it down here. Okay.
Yeah, that's great. So just so many considerations with that, and just, key things to think about. You mentioned the different tiers, Stephanie, too. And I think that's an interesting one to think about, because that's where you can really get into, if you're talking about a commission split, or even an hourly to an extent too, right? There's so many options there where you can have, we've seen practices that have 3 to 4 tiers, right? And it's like, well, if this happens, and there's all these conditions. So in my mind, I think the positives there are you can really motivate therapists and say, hey, you're doing a great job. We're going to give you really a great tier increase because of that. So it can be really motivating, really based on performance, which is nice, can feel really fair usually. The downside is, the admin work behind it can get crazy as far as like, how are we actually tracking this, right? If we have 3 or 4 different tiers and there's different considerations, how does someone move through those tiers and how do we keep track of that? So I think that's a really important thing to think about when you're thinking about the tiers is, are therapists going to keep track of this? Is our admin team going to keep track of this? Is the owner, like, who's doing the work here? How do we verify that's correct and think through those? Because that can add many, many hours per week.
It's an administrative burden. You also have to consider what your payroll software setup is, because, I've used 2 different payroll softwares, and payroll software, like, isn't genius. It can be hard to set up, and I think a lot of times isn't actually user friendly. They're just kind of like, we know you have to pay for our services, so here's what we're offering you. And so yes, it has to be like, it can be cumbersome. And so you have to make sure that the person running payroll completely understands the conditions, and also that then whoever's entering payroll into your payroll software knows how it works, because you're not going to be able to set up those conditions in the payroll software where
Right.
payroll knows if you put 28 sessions in, it pays higher. Like you're going to have to manually enter it
Right.
at the correct
Right.
rate, and that can be a lot. And then if you're having to correct a payroll, you have to consider if there is a cost to an off-cycle payroll, if you need to run it before the next payroll, or if you're going to ask your clinician if they can wait, and all kinds of things like that. But paying an off-cycle payroll same day can cost $90.
Yeah. Well, I do think, like you said, whenever you're considering this, I love what Steph said is if you are just starting out in this journey, just try to find something that's simple, that's easy to communicate, that's easy to hold accountability for. You can always, as you grow, as you start to see these different things happen, you can always add in tiers or add more structure into it. But I really do think you really need to consider too. I mean, my recommendation is to consider how much administrative time that processing of trying to figure out how to pay people, whether it's 2 weeks, every month, however you're doing your payment structure, payroll structure. It is also weighing in the pros and cons of the administrative time to figure out how we're paying people each time payday comes.
Yeah, I love that. That's great advice. Because if you start simple, you can always make it more complicated, right? Like we've said, start low on the pay, increase it over time, start low on the benefits, increase it over time. Same thing's true for this. Start simple and then add it in. When you see problems springing up, right? Whether that's retention, whether that's capacity, that's a great place where maybe you do add in some different structure, whether that's an incentive or a tier or a bonus. But I don't think there's a lot of reason to start with that, right? So if you're kind of dipping your toes in the water of getting into a more complicated structure, I'd first think like, well, what's the problem you're trying to solve, right?
Correct.
Oh, I love that. Yes.
And again, I mean, people making these decisions are carrying a big caseload still. You know, you're not where Christy and I are. I mean, I think I have 3 sessions this week. I had 2 last week. Christy is retiring herself in the next couple months. But you have to remember that
think about things.
yeah, you have to remember that you have to have time to think about this, but that you also have need to have time to implement and create the structure. And you're still seeing usually a full caseload with your first couple of hires, or even if you're not seeing a full caseload, you might be seeing 15 to 18, but you're doing so much heavy lifting with getting all of the setup. And so you just need to make simple systems from the start, because you don't have 40 or 50 hours a week of only administrative time. You've got maybe 10 or 15.
And giving yourself time and permission to learn is a big one as well, because, you know, me and Steph have talked about this a lot throughout the years. And, you know, myself, I'll speak for, is sometimes we can think that things can happen really quickly because, you know, maybe we've made it happen really quickly when we were building our caseload, or maybe it wasn't quick. It don't matter which way it is, but we sometimes underestimate how much time it's going to take to do things, how much time it's going to take to actually see how this is going to pan out, see what's working, what's not. And so with the simplicity part that we're encouraging to do, I'd also encourage you, and even if you're further down the road, to give yourself time to just see how things are going to be, and give yourself some grace in that learning curve of as you're trying to figure this out, because it takes some time. And we've had a lot of our group practice owner friends who, you know, they do get to a point in the journey and then they're reevaluating, wait, this worked for this period of time, but this is really no longer serving the organization and working really right now. I may need to evaluate it. Did it mean that all those years before it didn't work? No, they sustained the practice. They made it work. It's awesome. They just realized, hey, if I want to scale to another level, or if I want to add these benefits, or I want things to look differently, I may have to reevaluate. So at any point in time, I love the question you asked, is what problem am I trying to solve? Sometimes we do create problems where there are none. So let me go ahead and preface that. But, you know, what problem are you trying to solve? And then that often informs what next benefit you're going to offer, or if you're going to change a pay structure, or if you're going to add a tier, or we haven't talked about salary yet, but maybe we're at the place where we want to do a salary model at this point. So I really think what problem are you trying to address? And then trying to not have too many expectations to allow the time to just show you what you need to solve next.
That's great. Yeah. One of the worst things you can do in my mind is be making snap decisions on your clinician's pay, right? Moving them around, changing pay structures. So like you said, Christy, think about it, track it, talk to other practice owners. There's literally a gazillion Facebook groups. I feel like I hear about Facebook groups all the time.
Yeah.
You know, put some questions out there, and then make a decision and feel really comfortable in it, right? Instead of kind of snapping into that and giving your clinicians whiplash, you know, hourly, commission, all these things. So we briefly talked about hourly, which is, you know, dollars per hour that you're doing, very simple, right? Commission split, meaning that you're getting a percentage split of the revenue that's coming in. So yeah, let's talk about salary and what role that can play and how that looks. Any strong thoughts on that?
I think a lot of group owners who go to salary love giving the stability of a paycheck to their people. It does seem like the practices that I know that offer salary are pretty large. So their like base of money in the practice is probably at a certain level, or the pie that they're cutting from is just bigger. And my understanding is a lot of them do salary, and then there's kind of like a commission from that. So here's your base pay, and then you can bonus out at, you know, seeing this many sessions, producing this much revenue. But I would not recommend that anytime for getting started. You do not have enough information for that. And I also don't think that a small practice or even certain medium practices are probably set up for that. I don't really know enough about it, but everything I've seen from the practices that do it are quite large.
Yeah. And like you said, I mean, we have heard it work really well for some practices that are wanting to offer that stability, and that's a value for their team. But I do think with salary, it is hard because you have to have a clear accountability model.
Yes.
And when I say accountability model,
Yeah.
it is, what are our expectations? How can I maintain this salary? How can I, you know, when I'm starting somebody, what's the runway to get them to capacity to where they are, you know, working the amount of time it would take to, you know, be able to show revenue, I guess, for those hours worked. So it's a lot to think about. But I think this is what we're talking about right now as people are listening. You're thinking about this, or you're trying to problem solve this. It's giving yourself time to just weigh the pros and cons and think about it.
I also am curious if there are private pay, private practices that do salary. I have not heard of any. I do think that with the referral stream for an insurance-based practice, it does make it a little different and potentially more feasible to do salary within the insurance-based model. That could be just a bias on my part. But I do imagine that it would be a little bit harder to do with a private pay practice unless you are operating some sort of like program or model that is generating so much revenue and consistency, but you better have years of consistency as backup, as data to back up your inclination that you can go to salary.
I have run into that.
Like, yeah, if you have like contract, because we're thinking of a service right now as services being therapy services, individual, group, couple, family, but some practices have multi-services that expand beyond counseling, right? And so if you have contracts with people where you have this predictable income every month to provide these certain services, I can see where salaries can also sometimes be covered by that predictable income that you would need somebody in that role that would then cover that salary.
Yeah. I like drawing the line between a, you know, just a flat salary and a salary plus commission, as mentioned, right? Because in my mind, when I've seen a straight salary used, it's really difficult to have any motivation for that therapist as far as number of sessions, right? It's like, well, I'm getting this salary whether I do 25 sessions or 18 sessions, it's the same. And if that practice doesn't have accountability built into that, that's going to be a struggle. And I've seen that happen many times. So in my mind, you know, offering a kind of flat base amount plus commission is very different from just saying straight salary, because that motivation is still there. It's still easier to have accountability in that because pay fluctuates based on capacity, how many hours you're working really. So I just wanted to draw a line there because I think those are very different. I have a hard time when I see a straight salary. I haven't seen it work very frequently, but a salary plus commission is different. And then another just example that I was thinking about while you guys were talking is I saw a practice use salary as kind of a way to bridge pay for a new hire coming in. So it's actually, it was a way to they really felt strongly they wanted to compensate these new hires as they come in. So it wasn't like,
Sure.
well, as we're filling you up, it's going to be like a tough couple months. They're like, well, we'll give you a flat rate for those first couple months. And then once you get to your full-time capacity, salary is going to drop off and it's going to go just to commission or just, I think they're hourly. So it's going to go to
Oh,
hourly.
interesting.
So again, not something that you'd want to do starting out as a practice
No.
owner, but this was an established practice who
Yeah.
felt strongly about kind of supporting those newer
Cool.
employees. And I thought that was an interesting way of using it as far as kind of that bridge pay.
Yeah.
And I believe there was commission on top of that as well. So again, that gets at, you know, the multiple ways you can think about this and think of options here. I'm curious too, you know, oftentimes salary is used for leadership positions, right?
Yeah.
In some way, a salary, commission, salary. Have either of you used that or seen that used well, or other thoughts on kind of leadership compensation?
Yeah, this is where Christy and I consulting with each other probably doesn't give a ton of diversity to us being on webinars together. But I will say her leadership structure is different than mine. I have a clinical director and she has a leadership stipend or a clinical director stipend. So she has to see a certain number of sessions and she gets paid like the rest of the therapists. You get paid for that session. And then I ask her for a certain number of hours each week and I make it a range. And then she gets paid regardless of where she hits that range, a certain amount every pay period for those hours. I will say when you are bringing in leadership, I would start small. Like don't bring somebody in to only see 12 sessions a week and you assume that you know what they are going to do the rest of their time. I just brought her in at 21 sessions a week, doing like 3 to 5 hours of leadership work. And then a year and a half later, a year and some change later, I dropped it down to 18 clinical hours a week with the expectation of 7 to 8 leadership hours a week. What I will say you have to consider for that is, does that leadership stipend get paid even when they're on vacation? And or do they accrue PTO with those hours? Because I would recommend picking one or the other. Otherwise, they're kind of like beautifully double dipping and maybe that works for your practice. But if they're getting paid that stipend even when they're on vacation and accruing PTO, that might end up being kind of a really beautiful compensation package for them that doesn't feel so good for you. But I think also if you pay it on the times they're on vacation and there's maybe a time that they do a couple more hours in a week than what you asked for, it feels okay to you as the practice owner, right? So, but those are considerations because I did not consider that. And she was accruing PTO for a whole year for that. And that was the year she took a lot of vacation. I didn't mind the vacation, but I did realize at some point, like, oh, that math isn't working.
Yeah, and I would say you had asked just about like salary for leadership positions. I think it goes to the same conversation we're having about whether to do like some type of salary versus plus commission is I really think I see that when you get to a larger practice. Like I know for me at one point or at some point in the future, if I ever decide that, you know, I want to go do something else, but I still want to be involved in the practice, right? Then I anticipate that there would be somebody that would step into my role that would then be in a salary position, right? And so, of course, as an owner, then that means that there would not be as much, right, that I would be receiving. However, I would replace myself with somebody in a role that had clear expectations. And I do know of larger practices that at some point in their leadership structure, they do change over a few people to sometimes one, sometimes multiple, depending on how large we're talking about and how many locations and things of that nature, where then that person does become more of a salary-based person, or they become a salary plus some hours work. They may still be doing some clinical work, depending on what that structure is. But I do think you have to think of yourself, every little piece you grow, then you have to be evaluating what structure do I need in place to support the growth of this organization. And so it does mean that we're putting in leadership roles that are going to help keep the culture, help keep the accountability, help support the therapists, right? And then that's going to change their roles, their hours might change. We're about to go through another iteration of leadership structure changes in the fall. And so as we're growing, we're having to add more support, and what does that look like, and what are the expectations around that? But I do think with any type, whether it be salary, leadership structure, even potential bonuses, is taking, again, that word time to really carve out what the expectations are of that stipend, of that salary plus commission, whatever it is, and making sure that that's pretty clear. It can change, but I know that sometimes when we're doing things, we're like, okay, I really need to delegate this stuff, and I just need somebody to take this off my plate. And we don't always take the time to say, no, here's what I'm expecting from you from this time.
Mhm.
And so making sure the more clear you are on what you're expecting of the time that you're taking, you're either paying them a stipend or it could be a salary position, I think the better off you're going to feel about as a group practice owner.
That's great.
I also think that with leadership positions, this is another time that group practice owners can get ahead of the 8 ball in their decision making, kind of like the first time they hire therapists. So I would caution against moving too quickly with how big of pay or how many hours, because you will eventually like see the impact on profit and things like that from somebody just not producing as
Mhm.
much revenue. And at first, the idea of leadership is wonderful because, again, you're making that decision usually when you're stretched beyond capacity. So it's a little bit like, I'll pay anything for somebody to just take this off my plate. But you don't want to get to a point that you're really losing money on that position. That position might end up not producing profit, but that could be worth it to you. But I again just like caution decision making too quickly in this
Yeah.
position. And another consideration is that you don't start them with a stipend. It could be just the hours worked, right? Like if they're just
Mhm.
doing supervision and running a meeting, just pay them those hours at a different rate. You don't have to do stipend right
Yeah.
away.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great. You can start it super flexibly, right? And really,
Exactly.
there's really little risk there, right? As far
Yes.
as slowly ramp it up, pay them for the work that they're doing, but there's not a big kind of cost sitting on the books for that leadership position. And I love what you guys are saying. That's so true. You know, when we look at the profit and loss of practices, we sometimes will see that where there's just this huge leadership cost. It's like, what's happening here? And it's kind of a fact of, again, previous decisions where we've hired people too early. They're kind of
Yeah.
sitting there, they're doing good things, but it's like, do we need all these leadership positions? Are we really
Correct.
ready for that many? Right. So again, start small, start slow, pay flexibly. And as the practice grows, you can create more of that structure, more of those formalized, whether that's stipends, salaried pieces for people who are maybe there more permanently. But I mean, honestly, in my opinion, when you're hiring a leadership position, that person should be break even as far as the sessions they're bringing in
Yes.
versus their cost for quite a
Yes.
while. You may not be profitable on them, and that's totally fine. But they should be at least break even or close to break even until they're really becoming mostly leadership, right? When
Yes.
they're working a small amount of hours, there's really no reason for you to be losing money. They should be seeing a fair amount of sessions. So I think that's the key piece. And that's an encouraging thing, hopefully, for practice owners, because hiring someone does not mean you're going to lose money. It just means you're not going to bring in as much money from that person. They're still going to be bringing in sessions, just going to be kind of covering their cost and then going from there. So just something
And
to
that's where,
consider on
again,
that side.
knowing your books is really helpful because what does it mean
Yeah.
to cover costs for that
Right.
position? Because if they are decreasing sessions, are you increasing that somewhere else? Or do you have enough of a profit margin that
Mhm.
coverage can be absorbed without it feeling really bad?
Right. Right. Yeah. You need to know, what is the profit before, where are we right
Correct.
now? Right. So it goes
Correct.
back to that first point of measuring this and
Yeah.
looking at that regularly. Otherwise, you're kind of just making a gut call, which is
Correct.
hard to do accurately. So yeah. Well, so we mentioned hourly, mentioned commission, mentioned salary. I think those are kind of the big ones. There's obviously other options. There's other hybrids in here that you could always do. But yeah, other thoughts from either of you on kind of takeaways generally from what we're talking about here. I mean, I think my big takeaway is just go slowly and consider things. You know, analyze, go slowly. If you do that, you're going to be in a pretty good place. But takeaways for either of you or other nuggets of wisdom here.
I
Yeah, I
think
mean, when you
this,
said go,
yeah, go ahead.
go ahead. Well, I was just thinking when you said go slowly, I do just think don't take your like we're talking about, take your time. This does take some time to work through. I'll never forget when I was even trying to transition from 1099 to W-2 and I called Step Up. Like I'm talking, it took months. It took months of running, and maybe I did it too, it took me too long, but it took months to like just really get clear on what this was going to look like, why it was important, what problem it was going to be solving. And so, like you said, I think taking the time is a lot better than just making changes, very reactively in the moment. It's better to take your time, really feel good about what you're putting out there. And then at some point you just got to pull the trigger and just go for it. But take your time to do your research and really understand your numbers, because then that's going to make you feel more confident as you continue. And I always say that Stephen Covey quote, begin with the end in mind. Make sure you have a clear picture of where you're wanting to go.
Yeah.
You may not know exactly how it's going to look, but like, where do you envision this organization going? Because I think that also informs a lot of that structure, or that beginning structure that you're putting in, when you have that clear vision of maybe where you want the practice to go. Because I think you just evaluate decisions differently. And when you're starting to grow, you're just throwing stuff at the wall and hope it sticks, or at least that's what I did. I'm like, I'm gonna do this, so it sticks. Well, when you start to get in a different type of growth phase where your practice is continuing to expand, really knowing where that end mark is really does inform a lot of your decision making, even 10 years prior to when you're getting there. So I always think to myself, whenever I have therapists that are asking me different questions about what are the other benefits we might get, or what are the things that we can look forward to, I just say, look, listen, I'm always thinking about this. It's very strongly on my mind. But I never want to make a decision where then I have to come to you and then take something away from you. And so that's where I really think that intentional decision-making process is very important.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I would also say just this is hard. It's okay that it feels hard. It's okay. It's normal to lose a little sleep or to feel really stressed about this. If you're someone going from solo to group practice, or even in the early stages of group practice when you're starting to level up, but solo to group, once you make a decision for group, I would start earmarking money to hire people for those initial costs, because depending on what your home situation is, or depending on what solo practice looked like for you, there can be people who really, I had a hard time with solo practice. I haven't had as hard of a time with group practice, whatever that's about, COVID probably. If you just have money earmarked to hire the employment attorney, hire an accountant, it'll feel better, because you won't be like, oh, I don't have money for this, or this seems so expensive. Because in the early days, everything does feel so expensive, and you're just like, I don't have that. But it's actually money so well spent. So if you can just do yourself a favor and kind of earmark a chunk of dollars to have professionals help you make these decisions, I think you're saving yourself a lot of headache in the future. But also just know this is hard. It's not you. It's just business ownership and big decisions. And so if you can accept the hard, you'll get through the hard.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, that's so great. So true. On many levels, pay the cost upfront and save yourself the cost down the road. And yeah,
Yes.
business is super hard. I think entrepreneurship sometimes is, on LinkedIn and social media is like, like a nirvana of easiness. It's like, it's just
Yes.
not like that.
No.
There's a lot of great things. Don't get me wrong. I love owning a business, and I'm sure you guys do too, but there's also days where you're like, this is super difficult. So yeah, talking to other owners is so key in that. Well, you both are just a wealth of knowledge, and I'm so thankful that you both were interested in talking about this. And I think this will be great for anyone listening. You guys also have a venture together, so I'm going to let you talk about that, because that's super exciting. So please share.
Go for it, Christy.
Well, we're multi-passionate, as are you probably. I find that most group practice owners, there is a part of multi-passionate about them that really lights them up. And so one of the things that we do love is supporting group practice owners. And that's how, and through this hard that we had to figure out, we formed a friendship and then got in community with other practice owners. And it's really helped us survive, honestly, right? And go the distance and actually not feel necessarily overwhelmed or isolated in a lot of these decision-making processes. And so we started a venture together called the Practice Collab, and it really is about collaboration. So just like what we're doing today with Nate, collaborating with other industry experts or collaborating with other group practice owners, well, we really want to support group practice owners specifically to get through that hard through connectiveness and collaboration. And so you can find out more about us at thepracticecollab.com, but we do have some things that we've built in place, whether it's a collaboration, which is a cohort of people that pretty much do group practice ownership together in a small group for a certain period of time. Or I'll let Steph talk about something really exciting we have coming up this October that we're super excited to launch.
I just want to say really quickly, the first time you used the word collaboration, you did call it collaboration. And I just love that that's like the primary part of your vocabulary now is what we've twisted it into. Yeah, the collaboration is what we call our cohorts of group practice owners working in small groups. So that was just really sweet. But the other thing we have coming up is a not quite a conference called the Collab Lab, and it is a 2.5 day or an evening and then 2-day event in St. Louis in October, the evening of the 16th through late afternoon on the 18th, where we are hearing presenters speak. They're people from outside the industry, but related to things we do, like operational scaling, culture, marketing, finances. And they're presenting for an hour, and then we are working on implementing what they presented immediately after in small groups. Because, you know, the experience of conferences is often like this wealth of inspiring and motivating information, but it's like hour after hour after hour. And then you go home and you've been away from work for a while. And so you come back to a very bulky inbox, and then you just keep working. And then by the time you can go back around to the amazing information from the conference, it's 2 to 6 months later. And by then the information is a little diluted and you're just not quite in the inspired and motivated place. So we wanted to give people this opportunity to immediately do what the presenters are beautifully giving. So that's in October. We are very excited about it. It's for group practice owners in any stage of their group practice ownership. And we are limiting it to about 25 to 30 people, so we can keep that intimate feel and that real opportunity to get live help and just know each other in the event. And collaboration. Yep.
Collaboration. I love it.
Yeah.
Got to get some swag with that on it, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah, we do. Nate, we're gonna send you a t-shirt when we get one.
Yeah, I need one now. So that's great. Well,
I'm collabing, what it's gonna say. I'm collabing.
I'm collabing. That's amazing. I love it. What's the best way for anyone listening to this to get into contact with you both if they have not gotten into contact with you before?
Yeah, just heading over to www.thepracticecollab.com, and then you can just click on the contact button from there. You can explore the website for our offerings. And Christy's better about checking the email than I am, but she will flag me for anything we need to talk about together, or if somebody has a private pay, private practice question versus insurance space. But yeah, reaching out through there is the best way.
Great. Well, thank you again, both. If anyone listening to this wants the clinician profitability calculator that we talked about a little bit, you can email me, Nate at navigatorbookkeeping.us. Navigator Bookkeeping is kind of hard to spell. Bookkeeping has a lot of double letters. So you can also just Google search Navigator Bookkeeping and find it. I think it's the only word in English that has 3 double letter sets in a row, actually, which is, interesting. So yeah, Google search it. You can email me from there, and I'm happy to send that tool to you if it'd be helpful. But thank you both for your time, and we'll keep collabing here in the future. So
thanks, Nate. This was fun.
Thanks for having us, Nate.
Thanks.